still today the field, but growing. So yeah.
Fantastic. And so that makes it sound like what, 5 years strong now at now called Psychedelic Alpha. Yeah, that's fantastic. And so how's the space changed over time, right? In terms of number of companies, you've probably seen a lot of capital invested in the space. Certainly a lot of progress relative to drug trials and things like that. Catching us up to today, what have you seen that's memorable for you?
Yeah, for sure. So in 2019, right before I founded the website, Imperial College London launched the first kind of dedicated psychedelic research center. And now today we have dozens of psychedelic research centers across the world, at places like Johns Hopkins in the US, all the way down to Monash University in Melbourne in Australia. So the research has really picked up, and lots of that today has been funded by companies. So by 2021, I think we had around 50 publicly traded companies. That was the kind of first boom. It was called the shroom boom, or the kind of mush rush. It was during COVID, with all these stimulus checks floating around and very frothy public markets. So, there was a lot of activity then. Since then, funding and that type of thing dropped off quite a bit. That was maybe what people call the bursting of the psychedelic hype bubble. I think people realized, and investors realized, that many of these businesses are biotech businesses, right? The timelines are longer, the risks are higher. So we really saw a chill through the latter half of 21 all the way through till, I guess, the early part of this year. But now we're seeing funding come roaring back. And so I should also say, last year was a low point with MDMA being rejected, right, by the FDA. So that was another kind of difficult moment for the field. But now we're seeing, huge momentum coming back. So just in October alone, according to our psychedelic financing tracker, over $500 million was raised by just 3 publicly traded companies in the field: Atai, Cybin, and I think MindMed. And that's the largest already just with October. That means Q4 is going to be the largest quarter since the second quarter of 2021. So we're really seeing now a kind of second wind, and I think the difference is that first wave, as I kind of alluded to, was quite hype fueled. It was very easy to raise money. Some companies raising money just on the basis of a pitch deck and a patent filing. Whereas today, these companies, a lot of them are in phase 3. 6 of the candidates, psychedelic candidates, have breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA. Another one just a couple of weeks ago got that. We're seeing the companies are a lot more credible now. They're really doing the research. And, as we saw yesterday, which I'm happy to talk about later, was there's likelihood that these could come to market maybe up to a year earlier than expected, with some regulatory tailwinds in the US. So yeah, that's kind of the sketch. There was a bit of boom and bust, but it seems like we're now on a sort of more sustainable footing, hopefully.
Yeah, and I like that you called it sort of equivalent to biotech. I use the same phrase, I call it biotech on steroids, right? Just because I feel like while some of it is, dealing with things that are legal, similar to what we've experienced in cannabis, some of the things, depending on what areas you're looking at, may or may not be quite so legal. And the capital that's needed, the work that these guys are going to have to go through to get through these trials, some of the challenges they've had, as you pointed out, with last year with, not passing, through the FDA. It's just been an incredibly challenging space, but one that, again, as you mentioned, seemingly turning around. For me, I think I sort of look to the election and maybe probably, Secretary Kennedy at HHS and his views around the whole concept of kind of right to try seemingly was that turn, at least relative to stock prices. Is that what you would say similarly that seemed to make the turn, or do you see other catalysts that have caused this, most recent turn up in interest and capital flow and, some stock price movement?
Yeah, I think definitely there was some sort of non-specific excitement around what RFK and his allies could do for psychedelics. I think, a lot of my reporting since November has been trying to work out, especially in the first half of this year, trying to work out, what those concessions or catalysts might look like. I think it was less likely to be a wild card rescheduling, for example, and more likely to be perhaps a smoother process through the FDA or a kind of accelerated process. I definitely think investors were more optimistic due to the new administration. And we saw that in our most recent psychedelic investor survey, which came out last month now in October. And it showed that regulatory dynamics had gone from a key source of investor concern in the same quarter last year to now being a key cause of optimism. So yeah, I definitely think investors are excited. We're still waiting to see precisely what that actually looks like, how it's going to help psychedelics companies. But yeah, just yesterday, Compass Pathways, which is one of the largest companies in the space, they're a psilocybin drug developer. They announced that following a very positive meeting with FDA, they're now bringing forward their launch timeline and their commercialization planning by 9 to 12 months. Because they think that the FDA is going to agree to a rolling submission where they can, start submitting their dossier earlier than expected. So, the company was keen to say that, part of the reason for that was because they're ahead of schedule in their second larger phase 3 trial. So, they want to take credit for that they executed well. But I think they're also admitting that, there's allies in the government right now and in the agency. So yeah, it definitely seems like they're looking to move forward on this. And many of the listeners will be aware that RFK Jr. said in June that they're planning to get access to psychedelics within 12 months. Again, very non-specific, not clear what exactly that means. Right. But I think the fact that RFK said that in a hearing in June kind of recognized that a lot of people had been saying, well, what's actually going to happen? Are you still thinking about this? So it's clear that it is still, somewhere on the agenda for the current administration. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see sort of, I don't know, just the changing of the mindset, right? The other thing that comes to mind is, Ibogaine and its focused and approval within Texas, not really a state people might typically look to as having the most, open mind relative to new medicine and new things like that. Yep. So impressive to see it. It's interesting too, because I think obviously something near to any country's heart is, their veterans, their first responders. And it just seems like, this type of medicine hits home, for people who really need help in those areas, certainly not counting, people who are really struggling just with mental illness and some of the, drugs that we've seen starting to be developed that could really make a world of difference in people's, mindset of how they, see the value of themselves and their lives. And so it's been really nice to see the progress. And I think what you sort of just alluded to is, all right, well, so I'm ready to see something, get approved and get out into the marketplace. What drugs do you think are close? What are the companies that offer them that you think, over the next 1, 2, 3 years, we could actually see come to market?
Yeah, for sure. So as I alluded to there, Compass Pathways potentially submitting an application within the next 12 to 18 months, most likely looking at an approval early 2027 if they secure it. So yeah, we're looking at maybe, this side of 18 months. And yeah, they're probably the closest at the moment. Obviously, Lykos Therapeutics, which is privately held, they had their MDMA submission last year and failed. There is still some talk that the administration might find a way to get that approved, at least in a limited basis. Perhaps, as you just alluded to, focusing on use within the VA, for example. But that's still kind of an open question. Behind Compass, there are a bunch of other companies. We have a psychedelic drug development tracker that you can Google and find on our website that kind of lists them all. And we also show it as like a bullseye chart. So you have a lot of companies out in phase 1 and then 2 and 3. And in phase 3 at the moment, there's, I think, a half dozen candidates. There's Cybin, which has kind of deuterated psilocin, which is like a psilocybin-like drug that only acts for, I think, 4 or 5 hours as opposed to a bit longer with psilocybin. There's MindMed, which is developing LSD for generalized anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. And then, I think there's a couple of others that I'm blanking on right now. And then behind that, there's a bunch of candidates in phase 2. So still maybe 2-3 years away from a potential submission. And some of those are very interesting. So Atai Life Sciences just merged with Beckley Psytech, a privately held company, right? And they're developing 5-MeO-DMT, which is a very potent, short-acting psychedelic. They're developing it to be taken intranasally, so as a nasal spray. And another company, GH Research, is developing it in an inhaled formulation. So yeah, lots of companies now looking at these shorter-acting psychedelics, and their hope is that something that can see a patient come in and leave the hospital or leave the treatment center within 2 hours. They're making a bet that that's going to be easier to integrate within the healthcare system, perhaps even easier for patients. But yeah, that's all still, to be proven out in later stage phase 3 trials. But that's definitely the direction that things seem to be going towards, these sort of shorter acting, quote unquote, more convenient. Whether they'll prove more convenient for patients, remains to be seen. But for the healthcare system, maybe. Yeah.
Right. What do you see as the benefits of those two companies now coming together?
Yeah, I think Atai gets a lot of great benefit. I mean, they gain a phase 3 ready candidate, right? They're hoping to put that 5-MeO DMT candidate they acquired from Beckley, straight into phase 3, I guess, next year. So, yeah, I mean, they gain a big benefit. They bolster their pipeline. Atai took on a lot of bets. They started off as a kind of hub and spoke model, taking strategic positions in lots of different smaller drug developers. And over the years, some of the programs have failed as they naturally do in biotech. And they went through, I think, what looked like quite a painful process of kind of like trying to reorganize the company and bring the assets in-house. So yeah, I think they didn't have anything super close to phase 3, and now they do. So they've really kind of leapfrogged themselves in terms of the clinical trial timeline. And also, I think most people in the psychedelic community believe that Beckley Psytech, which has a lineage in this Beckley Foundation and Amanda Fielding, who was a big British psychedelic research funder, they think that the Beckley family and Cosmo, who ran Beckley, they have a lot of like knowledge of how 5-MeO DMT is actually used and experienced. Because some people in the psychedelic field worry that these very potent, subjectively intense drugs are being taken on by pharma companies who might not really be attuned to their actual experience in humans. They might not have tried them and so on. So I think some people think that a lot of people in the psychedelic community like Beckley because they think that they're kind of like the OGs. They're people who kind of really understand the drugs and their risks and their benefits. So
Right.
yeah, but no, I think Atai has done very well to acquire Beckley, and I personally know that there were lots of. I mean, we get contacted by investors a lot, and a lot of investors contacted us saying we want to look at Beckley, and unfortunately that was after the deal was already in motion. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Great opportunity now, though, right? And so from a country perspective, right, I think we have a tendency to think of this, of course, because we're based in the US. From a US perspective, you're based in UK, probably see more of the global picture. What countries are the, what you call the most favorable countries for psychedelic-based drug medicine development?
Yeah, so on the drug development front, I mean, the US is obviously always the one where people want to launch their drugs because the market is just so much larger than elsewhere. I mean, in terms of the medical market, you have the US, and then behind that, you have countries like Japan, obviously, and in the EU, you have larger markets like Germany. But outside those large pharmaceutical markets, it is going to be a bit of a challenge for psychedelics just because they are such a different modality, right? They have all these complications of the monitoring and the long duration of action, at least for the first-in-class ones. So, yeah, I think we'll really see the medicalization focusing on places like the US that do have a strong payer system. So even in the UK, this esketamine nasal spray, Spravato, which is approved here in the UK, is not, it's not provided on our public health system because it is quite expensive. And psychedelics will be expensive compared to the standard of care, which is very cheap antidepressant. So yeah, I think on the medical side, at least in the kind of like FDA approved, like regulatory approved model, I think you will see, the US be the very primary target. But then outside of that traditional model of, submitting a package of data and getting approval and then getting reimbursement, we are seeing other countries take different angles. So we're seeing the Czech Republic here in Europe, which has voted earlier this year to make, to change the law to make psilocybin legal to be administered in a medical context. So that could start next year. We've seen Australia, which rescheduled MDMA and psilocybin for PTSD and treatment-resistant depression, respectively. So, a couple of hundred, I think, patients have now accessed it there. And yeah, other countries are doing similar things, like Switzerland and Canada have kind of limited special access pathways. I mean, the issue with those pathways, though, is how are people going to pay for it? If it's not covered by insurance companies or national health systems, you do leave it up to the patient to pay. And given the amount of monitoring involved, and the amount of healthcare professional involvement in these, it's 10, 20 grand. So it's not cheap. So really, I think, the main project for the companies, at least, is getting approval in a country like the US and getting insurance companies to pay for it.
And is that what drives, you made the comment earlier about, medicine that, could hit and last for a few hours and sort of take care of immediate issues? Is that something that then has, I guess, more either marketability or usability because it doesn't need more of that ongoing monitoring, more of a human connection component to, to get through the process? Is that why they might start there and those might be the best early opportunities, or is it a different reason?
Yeah. I mean, the drug companies are obviously hoping to minimize the amount of psychotherapy used in their trials so that they can pitch this as more of a drug option, right? Rather than a whole psychotherapeutic bundle, which is quite messy and expensive. But yeah, I think on the shorter acting side, I think the bet is that if we can, have a treatment that lasts 2 hours, and it gives someone relief for maybe 3 months, then that's compared to what? It's compared to Spravato, this ketamine nasal spray, which appears to give patients relief for 2 weeks on average.
Right.
So if you have a drug that, it gives them relief for 3 months, then from a pricing point of view, you can start thinking, well, how many Spravato treatments would the insurer be paying for at the moment? If it's 3 months, maybe 6 treatments. So then you're looking at potentially a multiple of 6 times the price of Spravato, plus a bit of margin for the convenience to the patient and the healthcare system for having to do one dosing. So that's how these companies are thinking about it. For the companies developing the longer-acting psychedelics, like Compass Pathways with psilocybin, Lykos with MDMA, and quite obviously MindMed with LSD, which is very long-acting, obviously. These companies aren't necessarily, it's not all doom and gloom for them once these short-acting ones come to market. They just need to prove that their drugs are more durable. So if Compass or MindMed can offer, many months of relief, maybe 5, 6+ months of relief from one single dose, then that could still be much more convenient, particularly for patients, and also potentially for healthcare providers. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. But durability, how long that benefit lasts, that's the real name of the game here.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what kind of changes have you seen, I guess, over the last, several years in terms of investors in the space? Are you seeing any different dynamics of who's now considering investing in this space? Has that sort of landscape changed at all?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. I mean, many of our early subscribers were retail investors, who were very interested in investing in new high risk areas back then, because it was during the pandemic when there was a lot of higher risk appetite in that kind of zero interest rate period. Today, we see, a lot more institutional investors. So a lot of our subscribers, especially to our premium subscription, which is Psychedelic Alpha Plus, a lot of them who are paying us for our insights are, larger investment funds, even the kind of investing arms of pharmaceutical companies who are beginning to look at this. And yeah, still plenty of retail investors, but generally the investors we see on the public markets now, those smaller retail investors, they're generally more aware that this is biotech, and they're more kind of like sophisticated. They kind of have really done their research, and they're not just buying and kind of trading the stock. They're more buying it in a more of a long attitude, right? They're buying and holding. So yeah, that's the main thing we've seen. And then also based on our investor survey, early on, we used to see lots of investors in the field who had personal experience with psychedelics, and that's really what drew them to it. Whereas now we are seeing a small but noticeable trend towards investors who have no personal experience with psychedelics, and really they're driven by the data and the promise, and the potential of medicalization, even if it's not something that they're interested in trying themselves outside of the medical model. So I think that's another big shift. Like most of the early funding was driven by venture capitalists or philanthropists who had deep, positive personal experiences with psychedelics, whereas now it's really kind of show me the data. And just quickly, I know I'm talking a lot here, but one recent news story that kind of shows this is AbbVie, the large pharmaceutical company. They acquired a psychedelic drug a couple of months ago in a deal valued at up to $1.2 billion, right? And about 18 months ago, when they first announced the partnership with this company that they eventually ended up acquiring the candidate of, I wrote in our newsletter, I said, AbbVie becomes the first big pharma company to dip its toes into psychedelics. And quite quickly, I received a note from AbbVie's comms team saying, just to clarify, we're really interested in these psychoplastogens, these non-hallucinogenic psychedelics, which are very distinct. They don't have the hallucinogenic effects. So I read that as them saying, look, we're interested in these non-hallucinogenic, we're not interested in psychedelics. And then just a matter of a year or so later, they ended up buying a psychedelic candidate. And not only is it psychedelic, but from what I heard speaking to the company, even a 1 milligram dose, the low control dose, was very psychoactive. So it's kind of remarkable. Within the space of 12, 18 months, they went from apparently focusing on the non-hallucinogenics to now buying a psychedelic and developing it. So I think what that shows is that, these large companies and larger investors, even though there still might be stigma about psychedelics, at the end of the day, when they see the data, I think that's what will convince them. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's what's been the most impressive, is just to see some of the results these guys are seeing just even in the early stages. It's interesting too that you mentioned early on, sort of the interest was coming more from the retail space, because I do feel like that's been a bit of our experience. But I also feel like this investing category I think different from others, right? If you had 10 silicon chip companies, and either one company does well or people just get excited about chips, they all kind of move up. They're all selling the same thing and they'll operate differently in different margins. But for the most part, it kind of raises that whole category. I think we've seen that in the cannabis space as well, right? If we get legislative changes, like all the companies seemingly are going to move up. But, the psychedelic space just seems like one where, and I think it's probably inherent, right, in the biotech aspect of it, where I'm not sure taking the broadest approach, is the best. You will have lots of companies that, for whatever reason, just won't make it. And then a few will get it. And when they get it, it won't raise the other ones. It might help them raise capital and things like that, but nothing's going to change having, getting through trials, getting a medicine approved, and the time and the money and the effort that it takes to get that through. With that said, do you notice anything with some of the investors you talk to, either big or small? How do they approach selecting stocks? Are they only one or two stocks? Are they trying to take a broad approach? I know there's not tons of companies for them to choose from, I guess, depending on if they're just public or private. But how do you see that dynamic work with some of the investors you talk to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Yeah, and many of the investors I work with are, investing in biotech generally. So obviously, as you know, the general strategy there is to build a portfolio. If you're a VC fund, maybe 20 companies, right, is the usual number you might land on. The idea being that hopefully two of them will win, and if there's a 90% failure rate, then that's what you might expect. And hopefully they'll go on to do, to launch blockbuster drugs, and they'll return the fund, and the second of the winners will give you a profit, right? That's the traditional model. If you're trying to do that with psychedelics, just investing in the public market, you obviously have a smaller universe of companies. There's maybe 5 or 6 that are looking at a potential approval within the next few years. So yeah, it's a smaller universe. So it is quite binary, as you say. And yeah, we don't see necessarily catalysts that lift the whole space like you do in other fields. I do think this year, if you look at the stock performance of the field as an aggregate, like almost all the companies have gone up substantially, right? As you noted, since the administration change. But it is a good point. Yeah, once you see a breakthrough for one company, it doesn't necessarily translate onto the others. But I think, it is also maybe part of the reason is because, we just don't know how these drugs will be accepted commercially. Like, we don't know how much they'll be reimbursed. We don't know how providers will accept them. We have all the data suggesting that that's going to go well. Psychiatrists are saying that they're really excited to use these drugs if they're approved. So yeah, it's just a bit of an unknown at the moment. So I think this whole and also I guess just one other thing is the whole patent situation. Like, historically there's been a lot of questions around psychedelic patents. Some of the companies have competing claims, so again, some investors might be waiting to see how that shakes out. And think of the two companies I mentioned earlier, GH Research and Atai, which is now merged with Beckley. They're both developing 5-MeO-DMT for treatment-resistant depression, the same drug, same indication, different delivery mechanisms. So again, it's incredibly competitive. So great news for Beckley. While that might de-risk GH's program because it might validate the drug, it also creates a commercial nightmare because who knows who's going to beat who to market, who's going to have stronger patent claims. So yeah, it's very competitive. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And your comment too, just about the cost and insurance coverage, and I probably don't have a great sense of it of, what choices do patients and the insurance companies have today, right? If you're dealing with mental challenges, other things, whatever it is that you're trying to address, the drugs that we seem to have today, seemingly can help for a little bit, maybe are more of a Band-Aid, don't seem to be at least a real solvable treatment. So the other way you're dealing with it is, maybe putting them in a center and getting focused, psychological help or whatever, therapist help. That's not cheap, right? And that's time and intensive. So it does feel like, relative to what we have today to address these issues, which isn't cheap. And granted, some people who couldn't afford it or don't have the right coverage aren't even getting what's available today. That, man, if there was, even if it's a bit expensive, a drug or two that could really change the mindset of somebody, it just seems like there's somewhere in the insurance companies, there's some cost benefit around all those things. But
yeah, that's the big challenge. Yeah, proving the cost effectiveness and doing those analyses. And unfortunately, the sad thing is that, whilst mental health and things like depression do have a huge toll on individuals and society, the question is how that's monetized. So in the US, health insurers want to look at things like absenteeism, so how much are people missing work, and if because the employers are often paying for the insurance. So once you can start proving that, like, there's a real economic loss that could be helped by this, then that's when they'll start being paid for. The other thing is, practitioners and providers have to put, generally based on insurance policies, have to put you through the steps of therapy. So you have to start with trying one or two antidepressants of different types. Thereafter, you might be offered something like ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, and then you might get into things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is looking quite promising, and things like ketamine and Spravato. So psychedelics, at least initially, are going to be put towards the back of that. There'll be third, fourth, fifth line treatment. So you still will have to try the first. But unfortunately, because depression is such a big issue, it is a big market, unfortunately. And, I would personally hope that market reduces as drugs come to market. But yeah, the treatment-resistant depression market, as it's called, patients who have tried 2 or 3 drugs or options and they haven't worked, is still huge. So yeah, there's plenty of patients waiting, even at those third, fourth lines. And just to your point about, some patients getting to inpatient status, right, where they're taken into a center, and, that's really intensive. That is horrendously expensive for insurance companies. And in Australia, where they've rescheduled MDMA and psilocybin, as I said, one of the big issues is getting the insurance companies to cover it, because it's not kind of approved in a traditional sense. But Australia's largest private insurer, and around half of Australians have private insurance, it's called Medibank. They have recently started a pilot where they'll pay for psilocybin and MDMA therapy for depression and PTSD for patients that are in hospitals. And their argument is, these people with PTSD, for example, they're in our hospitals, which is costing us a huge amount of money. Every night is so expensive, compared to someone being at home and taking a maintenance dose of an antidepressant. So they're like, look, like, even though this is going to cost us 20,000 Aussie dollars, which is like a lot of money as well, if we can prove, if we can do a pilot and we can prove that over time it's getting these people home, getting them back to work and getting them back with their families, that's not only a good outcome for them, but that also will save us money. So that's the case, making the commercial case. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's where I feel like they'll genuinely see the returns, right? This isn't, addressing a cold or a broken bone or whatever. I mean, the incremental difference it can make is huge. You made some reference to, and I'm not sure if I'm familiar enough with all the current treatments that people will go through, but some magnetic cranial, what was that you were talking about that said has some promise? What is that?
Yeah, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And by promise, I mean, it's, it's pretty validated. It's been used for quite a while. But now they're working out ways of making it faster. So it's basically like it looks like what they used to use in the 80s to dry women's hair when they had a perm. This kind of like a thing that sits down here and they bring it down. And it's got magnets in it, and it stimulates. I mean, I'm not super familiar with it. It stimulates different parts of the brain, and it's been proven to help with depression.
I think I've heard of it. I just wasn't as familiar that it was that widely used. So it's interesting.
And actually, Nolan Williams was one of the pioneers, and he was based at Stanford, and he came up with the SAINT method, I think, which is a kind of accelerated TMS. And he sadly passed away a few weeks ago. But Stanford has been a real pioneer in this.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, besides, getting various drugs approved or through trials, where's the opportunity set ahead? What do you see for the psychedelic space over the next few years or so?
Yeah, so I think, the approval is the first step, really. I mean, hopefully we'll have psilocybin approved, as you said, maybe early 2027. And then I think the real challenge for the field is, at least in the medical kind of approved model, is the infrastructure. So, Compass and the drug developers will be hoping that a lot of the existing healthcare infrastructure switches over to deliver psilocybin. Hospitals maybe find rooms to deliver it, and clinics, delivering TMS and ketamine switch some of their capacity to psilocybin. But I think there will also be a need for, psychedelic specific clinics and help, and, companies that help the existing clinics, get their head around psychedelics. So I think there's going to be some work on the infrastructure side. Not clear how much of it will need to be, new psychedelic companies and how much will be the existing healthcare system. But I think also, the state level policy reforms. This year we saw a huge amount of bills introduced in January, I think in half the states. And it was a huge amount of work for us, passing through them and updating everyone on those. But I think, again, next year, I think we should expect to see a huge amount of policy activity. A lot of that might be, looking to fund research or create working groups. But some of it could be more interesting, like, potential state level medical models or policies to try and fund approvable research. So like what Texas is doing with Ibogaine, right? They've carved out $50 million to kind of match fund a private company's efforts to develop Ibogaine as an FDA approvable drug. So I think we're probably going to see a lot more of that. And then, outside of the US, as I say, I think I don't think other countries are going to be the focus for market launch anytime soon for these companies, but I do think there's lots of other interesting stuff going on. So yeah, I think particularly Czech Republic will be interesting to watch, and Australia and all these other countries I mentioned earlier. So yeah, there's loads going on. It definitely keeps me busy.
Do you think the growth in this space will still come from what I would refer to as sort of smaller startups, which I think is sort of a very biotech thing, versus the bigger pharmaceuticals? Will they get to a point, do you think, where they'll start to do their own research and their own drug development? Or do you think, at least in the near term, it's them either making strategic investments or, when they're ready, making acquisitions and not really getting into the space directly themselves, or at least originating the development themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. A lot of these big pharma companies, they look at a psychedelic company and, they think I could buy it now for $1 billion or a couple of $1 billion maybe. And to them, that's nothing. So from their point of view, why take the kind of risk, the reputational risk of acquiring a psychedelic with all the cultural baggage? Right now, that's kind of the view they took for a long time. But I think now that AbbVie has entered the field and has, bought a psychedelic asset that's, perhaps phase 2B, phase 3 in the next couple of years, maybe, I think that's really changed things. I mean, just anecdotally and based on our data, we're seeing a lot more pharma companies signing up to our paid subscription and also to our free mailing list. We have more than ever. So we're definitely seeing interest coming from pharma now. And I think, all it takes is, one company, especially a large one like AbbVie, to step into the field in a substantial way, and the others certainly take notice. But yeah, I mean, Compass looks like it's going to be the first to market now if it gets approved. And they've maintained all the time that, they want to take this all the way through to approval. They're not looking to get acquired. But it will be interesting. I think in the next 12, 24 months, I think we're likely to see some more M&A. So yeah, something to watch.
Well, it's been an exciting year. I was looking at just performance of different categories, basket of psychedelic stocks, S&P 500, even throwing in Bitcoin. I mean, I have over the last year group of psychedelic stocks, again, depending on which stocks you own, but call it plus or minus, actually, is this even for a full year? Yeah, plus or minus around 55%. I've got Bitcoin at 48% over the last year, not year to date, but full year. Then S&P only up 17, call it 18%. So it's had a nice turnaround, beating, some areas that either, like Bitcoin, have been, unique, emerging, or S&P, which, 17% for the S&P is still a fantastic year. So yeah, this has been a really fantastic year for these stocks, and I'm with you. I hope we see a lot of growth and progress within the industry soon. All right. Well, thank you so much, Josh, for making time today. Is psychedelicalpha.com? Is that where they can find some of your tools?
Yeah, psychedelicalpha.com, and people can reach me at josh@psychedelicalpha.com. And they can subscribe for free or pay us if they want our premium insights.
And then I think Twitter, you're psychedelic_alpha, right? Your Twitter account.
You're testing me now, but you can use the search bar.
Right, absolutely.
Thanks for inviting me.
Very cool. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Everybody else, thank you for tuning in. I think I might still be replacing McKinsey tomorrow, so I might be your guest host as well tomorrow. But again, thanks for tuning in, Josh. Thanks for your time. Everybody else, have a fantastic day. This is where it helps to have some professionals like McKinsey in the chair, because I'm scrambling for my little outro video. Hold on, I'm going to find it. I got it. See you guys.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.